Welcome to a BTS podcast. Can I start by asking, with the current high-profile cost of living crisis and the debate around energy security, what exactly is the current compliance regime associated with publicly funded energy efficiency schemes? Perhaps I can start by asking you, Nigel.
So, public sector schemes have traditionally required a higher level of compliance than that you would normally come across within the able to pay sector. So, public sector schemes are regulated with a public availability standard. That standard being PAS 2030, which is the installation standard. There's a new standard, PAS 2035, and more recently PAS 2038, which set about defining the design standards for whole house or building retrofit. Um, in terms of schemes such as Eco4, the Local Authority Delivery Fund, Home Upgrade Grant, Social Housing Development Fund, they all require PAS compliance and they all require work to be lodged under Trustmark as a mandated scheme. PAS 2035 sets out the roles and the requirements and the risk pathways to mitigate the risk when considering a whole house or a whole building retrofit. So it looks at what measures are going to be deployed, the risk associated with their measures, how they're going to interact, and define certain roles and standards that need to be taken into consideration as part of the overall design process. PAS 2030 is then very much focused on them individual measures and sets out the requirements for the installer who's going to install those measures.
And certainly from where I'm sat, I recall PAS 2030 goes back a long way and has supported the delivery of, as Nigel says, individual measures and the installation standards that they need to follow. But what PAS 2035 is looking to do is encourage that kind of whole house approach, whole systems thinking, actually design retrofits with a kind of medium to long term plan in mind, understand what's right for the home, as a collection of measures. Might not necessarily all be delivered in one go, but don't install measures that might perhaps compromise the installation of additional measures down the line. So it's really trying to encourage this whole house approach, respecting the interdependencies between insulation, ventilation, the sizing of heating systems, off the back of that. The consideration of renewables that might be added on.
Typically, our building stock and our approach to energy efficiency has been to target individual measures onto properties, and them measures have largely been targeted by funding. So a quick win has always been loft insulation, cavity wall insulation. But as we look at the climate crisis, the energy security crisis, and more importantly, net zero at the moment, that hasn't really done a great deal to manage the whole carbon production from them premises. We've lost a lot of heat because we've focused on singular measures. We've continued to roll out gas boilers, which have increased the carbon footprint. So what we're setting a standard here for is to actually retrofit a whole house over time, be it through a medium-term retrofit plan, or if somebody's financially got the money available to do it, by tackling that whole house at one go. Looking at the building fabric first and foremost to make sure that the building retains the maximum amount of heat it can, and then looking at low carbon heating technologies, and then in an ideal world, then looking at locally produced energy through solar photovoltaic. This is a shift. It's a shift in standards. It's increased the bar. It's meant that industry stakeholders who have been involved traditionally in retrofit have had to increase the skill sets available to them. Some of them have had to consider how, in fact, they could roll out more appropriate contractor-subcontractor models and engage with organisations who could cover measures that typically they would not have considered or entertained in the past. Government-funded schemes, particularly Eco4, tends to add up when you deploy certain measures together. So the days of being able to install individual measures under public funding are very much a thing of the past.
What is the role of the Installation Assurance Authority, and why is the topic of measurement so important when it comes to retrofit?
So the Installation Assurance Authority, a technical authority for the installation sector, we operate as a UCAS certification body across all of the installation standards, typically cavity wall, underfloor insulation, room in the roof, internal wall insulation, hybrid, external wall and park homes. And increasingly, we're starting to look as well at the technologies such as solar thermal, solar PV, air source and ground source heat pump. We provide a compliance regime and a compliance oversight for our members, developing technical best practice and working and contributing to steering groups to make sure that the standards that are deployed are effectively practical and fit for purpose, and try to strike that balance between the puristic interpretation of a standard and the academic interpretation of a standard and the practical application of that standard. So we very much work to support our installers to ensure that their understanding of the standards and their application of the standards is consistent. And we've worked with BTS as part of that to ensure that processes to help and support background ventilation are actually consistent with the standard, can be practically applied, but in this case, we can use some of that scientific evidence base to clearly define what is absolutely essential when it comes to ventilating a property.
And so then for me, the whole reason I was keen to have this conversation is that whilst the intent of PAS 2035 is encouraging a whole house approach, and that is of course sound, there's a very real risk that we're carrying out whole house assessments, but never truly really understanding the property in question and understanding kind of what's right for it in terms of upgrades. And so whilst there's a role for measurement and monitoring cited as part of the retrofit evaluation part of the PAS 2035 process, it's frankly been interpreted as a nice to have kind of bolt on at the end. So yeah, I'm here today to preach that you can't manage what you don't measure. And yeah, as Nigel's just alluded to, kind of a good case in point here being Annex C of the PAS 2035 standard, which is very rightly making the link between insulation upgrades and the needs for assessing ventilation. But I think it's inadvertently thrown up a lot of grey areas, and it quickly becomes a subjective matter. So basically a retrofit coordinator making a subjective assessment on the levels of air tightness of a property. And we all know you can't just walk into a property and know its air tightness level. Similarly, you can't walk into a property and know how well insulated it is. You can't even look inside a cavity and know how well insulated it is. So yeah, my big thing here is, and from the Build Test Solutions perspective, is that no two properties are ever the same. And an air tightness test, in the case of this Annex C in particular, is the only possible way of objectively assessing a home pre and post works to then determine the best course of action.
Yeah, and I guess from our point of view, it's kind of a perfect relationship, the Insulation Assurance Authority and Build Test Solutions, because in the absence of that testing and in the absence of that evidential approach, the standards tend to be applied in a very black and white method. So somebody will turn up to a property, and if that property hasn't got trickle vents or it hasn't got a 10 mil door undercut, they'll set to convincing the homeowner first that they need to introduce them trickle vents, or they need to cut that 10 mil off the bottom of the door to make sure that they've got appropriate background ventilation. The way in which it's interpreted and monitored by the owners of the standards effectively would lead them to that decision, because the fear is if they don't do that work and they can't evidence that the property is suitably ventilated, they're going to lose the measure. They're going to lose the income associated with that measure, or they're going to have to go back and revisit that property, try and convince the homeowner to retrospectively have that work done. Having that work done in itself might seem pretty straightforward, to put a trickle vent in a window, but when you think somebody might have just invested their hard-earned cash in a new window, and then they've got a window warranty on it, and you're then going to start drilling holes in it to fit trickle vents, that's not always the most sensible solution. So by working with BTS and coming up with a process that allows us to test, provide the evidence, isolate rooms, and understand what's actually happening in terms of the cross-floor ventilation to that property, it's taken away a lot of cost, it's improved acquisition opportunities, but importantly, it's provide that evidence base to which we can not only make sure that homeowners are fully protected and correctly ventilated, but we can use that evidence base as well to help inform the development of the future standards. Standards without testing seem to be standards that are set back in time, and we need to be focused much more on testing as a way in which to evidence the application of the standard.
And being completely open here, like a very real concern of me involving BTS in this process and putting forward our pulse technology for the air tightness and background ventilation assessment side of things is that there's this risk of it being perceived as being used as a tool to cut corners or to not have to do ventilation. But the reality is what you see on the ground, again, to this kind of point around no two properties ever being the same, is that it goes both ways. By measuring and understanding how leaky a property is from the outset, and like I said, objectively measuring that is, we're seeing sort of 1950s high-rise blocks that clearly have wet plastered walls and concrete slab floors, really robust kind of fire compartmentalization. Those properties, those flats are really airtight, kind of almost passive house levels of airtightness. And of course, then clearly you do need to introduce a very specific set of ventilation solutions. But then equally, you can test a lot of properties that are frankly colanders. They leak like a sieve. And the real issue there is this the matter of overventilation. Again, if you interpret the words as read in Annex C at the moment, irrespective of that fact, you would have to be adding in trickle vents and door undercuts to a house that is already excessively ventilated or excessively connected to the outside. So you've got kind of two extremes there, and measurement is the only way of identifying that and throwing up kind of what is the most appropriate course of action for any given circumstance.
Yeah, I don't challenge one slight element of that, and Annex C tends to be mute on the requirement as a normative requirement for trickle ventilation. Unfortunately, the way in which standards tend to get interpreted is we judge what's inadequate, and then we take a view on what adequate should look like. And in this case, we know that quite often testing is proving that adequate is far from the need to issue or to retrospectively fit trickle vents. But the benefit of this and the beauty of this for me is we're starting to gather a lot of evidence on the performance of particular property archetypes. We're no longer having a conversation that says we have to go at the extreme. We're saying if you take this particular type of property and you introduce EWI, it might be a solid floor property, there's a good chance you're going to have to increase the ventilation if it doesn't exist. If you have a mid-terraced, no subfloor insulation, and you're putting a measure like loft or cavity wall in it, there's a good chance that the ventilation, the natural inherent ventilation, will be sufficient. So it's providing us with a really good starting point from that point of view. And in some cases with local authorities, as we introduce a layer, we're measuring the performance of that layer. So that as well is equally as important when we write the future standards. But the most important part for me about any of this is the standard, in my view, is very robust. The stuff we're doing in terms of testing is very robust, but it's incumbent on us and the industry to make sure that that is well policed, that is well maintained, and that it doesn't become an option to avoid doing background ventilation. It becomes the evidential base you need to do the appropriate background ventilation.
Totally agree. And the point you make around data is a really interesting one as well. That historically there's not previously been any culture of measuring existing buildings. Yes, it's been a compliance requirement under Part L for new build for some time now. But you try and dig out the research and the data sets and as to the kind of the air tightness characteristics of existing homes, and it's very thin. So you're absolutely right. So until you start measuring, you can't possibly expect to understand really, truly what impact adding cavity wall insulation has to the air tightness of a property, changing windows and doors, upgrading kind of draft strips and seals. Until you're measuring before and after in lots of those instances, we can't possibly expect to learn and understand what works well and not so well. So the data is a really exciting element to this as well.
What are the next steps?
we're putting our toe in the water at the moment with background ventilation testing, air tightness testing. There's a whole suite of tools that we can now start to look to deploy to help make informed choices around retrofit, energy efficiency retrofit, and whole house retrofit. And for the industry, this is a real key moment because we've increased the standards, we've increased the operating knowledge, the competency of the industry to a level never seen before with the introduction of new level 5 roles. Now we've got to get smart about testing. Now we've got to make sure we're not over-engineering things. So as we move forward now, we'll build off the back of background ventilation, and I'd encourage installer companies to look at it, to invest in it, to look at how it can benefit their business, but not in isolation. Start thinking about how you can sensibly use thermography. You can start measuring thermal performance using something like the heat transfer coefficient. And other tools and other models are available. But it's about getting smart with data now. It's about having the evidence base so that you're not stood waiting for the tap on the shoulder for somebody to tell you that that installation has failed. You've got the evidence. You've got the full robust data that says no, it isn't. It's performing exactly how it should perform because we've measured it, because we've done what is necessary. Just because we haven't gone on and introduced additional background ventilation, it doesn't mean we've failed. It means we've ventilated the property appropriate. It means we've deployed the appropriate measures. So we've got as an industry to get smarter with the use of testing and testing equipment, use the professionals, learn from the professionals, develop the processes. And that way we will get sensible standards that we can all work to.
Yeah. I can only really build on that. It's that, and I probably would say this, wouldn't I? But the future is absolutely measurement. Otherwise, we really at risk of just kidding ourselves in terms of relying on models, predictions, assumptions about the impacts that the measures we're installing have. We need to quantify, validate, verify that those impacts have indeed been delivered. And so our view of the future is that regulation is going to increasingly shift to outcomes-based regulation. Actually having to put your money where your mouth is, measure and demonstrate the quality and performance of the works that you've delivered. Clearly, there's a whole host of different potential models around that, but one of them is bringing measurement in-house and having that capability, almost like you might imagine a car manufacturer having a test track that can. You're building new products and you're testing them before they go to market. It's that kind of thing, isn't it? Of you're delivering a product and a service to a customer, you want to demonstrate that it actually works, actually delivers what it says on the tin. And so you could deliver measurements in-house and use that as a part of a continuous improvement process or system, right the way through to just like you might commission an energy assessor or a retrofit assessor, building surveyor, those kind of people, professionals to come in. We're also seeing large uptake of our measurement equipment into those kind of fields. And again, the subcontract model, if you like, is also one to look at or one to watch and bring that capability in-house in that way.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think as well, with there's bound to be a degree of nervousness out there. There's bound to be people who think, you know what, we've tried this sort of stuff before, or we've always erred on the side of caution because we don't want a technical monitoring agent tapping on our shoulder to say this measure's failed. What I'd advise them people to do is to speak to yourself, Luke, to speak to Build Test Solutions, to speak to my own organisation. Try a little bit even, get one of the teams to go out and do some testing with you, build up the confidence, do the course, do the program. And through time, I'm sure you'll find that testing has got a place to stay. It's got a very positive place within this industry.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say measurement's traditionally been sort of in the domain of academia. It's a research kind of tool, only practiced on a small number of properties in the interests of whether that's a government-sponsored research project or PhD or something. But that's exactly what we're trying to challenge here. At Build Test Solutions, at least, we're looking to develop new tools and techniques, new measurement methods that really are simple to use, very accessible, affordable, and something that allows measurement to be adopted and used in the mainstream industry. And I really do think government are recognising that these tools are now coming on stream and that they exist, and we'll increasingly see policy coming on stream around that. I know Eco4 touted this kind of pay for performance type model. So rather than working to deemed scores, actually using measurement as the basis of showcasing delivered benefits. We're seeing in the EPC action plan that government host that they're looking to open up more and more of the input fields to the SAP assessment, so that you can plug in measured parameters and see those rewards in the SAP scores, the EPC ratings themselves. And yeah, I think it's only a matter of time until kind of Part L and other elements of the building regulation shift to becoming outcomes based.
Yeah, I totally agree.
So, what is the call to action?
Well, now is the time for us to start to look at the development of the PAS standards, look at the future steering group work, and looking at making sure that testing is very much inherent within that whole PAS process. It can't be something that we write a process for because there's a grey area or there's a vague area within Annex C, for example. It's got to be seen and recognised as an appropriate route and in some cases a normative requirement. Testing has got to be embedded in the fabric of how you approach building design, assessment, suitability, and ventilation. And I think my personal role in that is to make sure we influence the steering group to make sure we get the right product out of it. And that testing becomes a way of life within this sector. We've got to continue to build partnerships like the healthy partnership we've got with Build Test Solutions. It's not a partnership we entered into in isolation. We've made these standards deliberately supplier agnostic. We can look at other providers in this space, but we're working together towards a shared goal, which is to have effective measurement to help inform effective retrofit at scale. And it's time for the industry, I suspect, to get a little bit more involved and engaged and look at how they can take the opportunities presented by these processes and build them into their business.
Yeah, I liked what you said earlier, Nigel, about I know we've talked a lot today about the background ventilation testing standard. I know that's had a lot of profile in the industry, but it is just the tip of the iceberg. It is just dipping the toe in the water, and there is so much more potential around going further and measuring and understanding the thermal performance of the fabric itself, understanding U values, and measuring ventilation flow rates. There are all these things that we can be so much more objective on and regulate on the basis of, again, what's been delivered rather than just speculatively designed. And the macro thing for me here is that if we're not measuring, if we're not validating what we've delivered, then we're all just kidding ourselves. We're living and working in a world of theory, and PAS 2035 and other standards can tighten down as much as they like, but who's to say that they're actually delivering on the ground? And this is where, for me, measurement is, again, really key. Otherwise, all the bureaucracy, all the work and the effort going into delivering is ultimately for nothing if we can't be sure that it's actually delivered.
I totally agree with you. Totally agree. I think that the main objective is you do what's right for the property. You make sure the consumers got a quality job. What you don't do is undermine that quality job by doing things that perhaps you're doing because we've always done it that way, and over-engineering the solution.
Well, thanks, Nigel. Pleasure talking to you as always. Really interesting chat, and look forward to working together on many more initiatives in the future.
Yeah, thanks, Luke. I mean, this has been a real, it's been a really good, positive example of how we brought industry together to pilot a scheme. We developed a process with technical experts, with your own organisation, Build Test Solutions. We put it into practice. We've had it tested in anger. I think there's so much more of this we can do together, and I'm looking forward to to more chats like this, but equally to how we can help further develop the process.